So my main area within economics is kind of notions of social sharing, alternative property rights, and commons. And I'm the person who's been most important for this has been Eleanor Ostrom, who came along and is a political economist in the States and challenged the idea of tragedy of the commons and looked at how people around the world manage forestry and fields and so on and so forth collectively, and found to her surprise that they often manage them quite well. And she's done quite detailed kind of case studies of this involving both indigenous and non-indigenous communities, and I could talk more about that. And a lot of her ideas are very much inspired by indigenous, which is ironic in the sense that she's a woman who very much comes from the kind of free market right and Hayek. One of the things I was going to quote from her, which I think gives an idea of importance of indigenous. So this is something she said when she won an American Politics Prize a couple of years ago. I'm deeply indebted to the indigenous peoples in the US who had an image of 7 generations being the appropriate time to think about the future. I think we should all reinstate in our minds the 7-generation rule. When we make really major decisions, we should ask not only what it will do for me today, but what it will do for my children, my children's children, and their children's children into the future. So if you look at the kind of present economy, it's unremittingly short-termist. So literally, if you look at the terrible events in Greece and all of the austerity being imposed on people, that's to try and keep bond markets happy, and bond markets look at the next few minutes. A lot of people have said to me, isn't the idea of cuts in Britain, isn't that ecological and living within our means and so on and so forth? But it's basically a programme of marketisation, privatisation, giving more and more control to kind of short-term interests. So, you think of things like housing market and speculation. We have an economy where we think of what will generate us income very much in the short term, and we're not thinking about what's sustainable in the very long term. And, I'd certainly point to this idea. So the 7-generation rule, I'm hoping you won't ask me why it's 7 rather than 6 or 5, because I have no idea. But that just as a basic principle for the economy, if our politicians are saying, well, is this actually going to be good for the next 7 generations? We're coming up with policies for the NHS which are going to be good for the next seven generations, and, we're actually going to protect the environment so we sustain the next 7 generations. That seems to be not an eccentric or revolutionary notion, but that just seems to be a kind of really basic notion. So she got that from the Iroquois, who I think the Iroquois prefer to be called the Haudenosaunee. I haven't quite got the pronunciation, because some people say Iroquois is like something derogatory. But the Iroquois, learn how to pronounce it properly, are the peoples who still exist around New York State and I think Toronto in Canada. They're very, very interesting in terms of economics and politics. Some people say that American democracy came from the Iroquois, though some people say, well, the Iroquois had democracy and they're not convinced the Americans do. But certainly their kind of politics, political theory, is as important as Plato and Aristotle. So they had a confederation between 6 nations who were at war. So some people say, oh, that's where the American Constitution came from, of a confederation between different states. And Ostrom very much inspired by them. Marx was inspired by them. So Marx, before he died, was writing his ethnographic notebooks on anthropology. So it's a bit of a mystery why he didn't get around to finishing Das Kapital. I always say to people, that he kind of wrote most of Das Kapital on cigar packets that was then found under his bed by Engels and was reconstructed. So he never actually got round to finishing Das Kapital. But one of his passions in his last couple of years of life was his ethnographic notebooks. So what he did, and this was how he kind of got into economics, that what he would do is he'd take like Adam Smith and Ricardo and so on and make notes and think about what they were saying. So what he did was took Lubbock's, I think, Prehistoric Societies, and Henry Main's stuff on anthropology, and 4 or 5 other thinkers, and made marginal notes. This is a big digression, but I love his notebooks. And what's fun, I've got a copy of his notebooks, which I sort of value, is, if you do anthropology, you must look at this, it's really wild. And of course, Marx then was very interested in Morgan. He did study the Iroquois. I'll eventually get back to the Iroquois. But what's wild about his ethnographic notebooks is he had this amazing way of writing where he would write a sentence half in English and half in German, and then mix in Sanskrit and indigenous languages. So if you ever get the chance to look at any of this stuff, and there's a guy called Rosemont who's done an amazing essay. I mean, Marx really, I think would probably, in many ways, I'm not having a go at the SWP, but I don't think they'd really cope with all this, really. He was quite a wild man. Anyway, the Iroquois, various people were interested in the Iroquois because they had lots of conflict, came up with a confederation, inspired lots of different political thinkers. So they had the 7-generation rule. They also had the idea of consensus decision-making, also the idea of, a bit like the Green Party of Caroline Lucas, matriarchal society led by women, yeah? And, quite interesting political theories. Again, I'm going to edge on to being slightly critical of Indigenous. So I think one of the nice things about this is, in a sense, like the Iroquois, it's like Portugal or Scotland. It's just like a nation, and it's a collection of nations. And there's a danger with Indigenous that we kind of exoticise them and think of them as something sort of alien and romantic and primitive. And certainly in the, what sadly became the US and Canada, I think that was a step backwards. Not that I believe in linear history. You've got nations with citizens and people coming together politically and making decisions and working out how to run their economies. And that's the way we should see Indigenous, rather than some kind of rainbow warrior myth. So to get on some of the kind of criticisms of this, I think certainly my politics is very influenced by indigeneity, but I think it's something that we have to have which is critical, because in a sense it's just another way of looking at human societies, and human societies fuck up, and Indigenous people are not perfect. I'm also very conscious of this idea that a lot of the time we have strange ideas of history. So one of the things that really went wrong with a lot of interpretations of Marxism is that the perfect society is going to be in the future. And then you have some varieties of romantic green thought where it's kind of like in the past, and hey, the Green Party often say this, but you have something to say, maybe things were good in the Bronze Age or whatever. And I think one of the things which is quite nice about indigeneity is it disrupts this a bit, that you have, as I say, Indigenous people, quite often they face racism. So again, Alan Garcia was saying very racist stuff to the people in the Amazon, that they were like the dog. So how you can call people who use some dogs, it's just outrageous racism, and saying they're like the dog that has a bone and it doesn't want the bone, but if anybody else tries to get the bone, it will growl at them. To say they've got all this wood and oil and so on, they don't want anybody else to have it, and how outrageous, and you've got to kind of modernise and have progress, and they're backward. And what Indigenous people say is, when people come with this rhetoric, basically they want to steal our lands, yeah? So, you might have myths of progress and so on, but, development in that sense has not been development for Indigenous people. But like I said earlier, they want hospitals. All these people are on Facebook and social media, and obviously there's problems of access to internet and World Wide Web and so on in the Amazon, and obviously there's a bias towards people who are richer getting hold of it, but they certainly want to use that. So it's not this kind of idea of unilinear time and going back into the past. So certainly in the past, Indigenous people have quite often damaged the environment. So if you look at New Zealand, a lot of the kind of large fauna in New Zealand was exterminated. There's a huge debate in archaeology about megafauna and whether mammoths and woolly rhinos and so on died acts of climate change, or whether they were killed by Indigenous people or not. And certainly in the past, Indigenous people have damaged the environment. I think there's as I say, there's a danger of romanticising. I mean, what I tend to suspect, I haven't really got the empirical research, is quite often people did damage the environment and then developed better ways of dealing with it. And so we can't just kind of mythologise them. My mind's going in various directions, but I good example of where you can't be uncritical. I've got contact with an indigenous activist in Alaska who will say, it's outrageous that for hundreds of years we managed salmon stocks and now we're not even allowed to do that, and how can we go back to managing the land? And he was saying, well, hey, it wasn't all great with the indigenous. Quite often there was racism amongst indigenous, quite often there was sexism in the society he came from. You'd have like a ruling group and you'd even have slaves. So you can't just say indigenous wonderful, but equally, it's interesting if you look at Europeans going to North America, of having massive devastation to the environment and killing millions of people. It's probably a bit much for them to say, hey, you destroyed this species in this place. What I would also emphasise is the idea that if you're concerned with the environment, not to be caught up with ideas of kind of wilderness. And what has certainly happened, and Ostrom's been very good at developing this, is that people live in the environment, and if they destroy it, they haven't got a basis for prosperity, so they find ways of managing it. So if you look at the Amazon, again, we have a myth of kind of wilderness, but archaeologists have established that for pretty much all of the Amazon, you have black soils that show human occupation. In parts of the Amazon, you had quite large cities. So again, indigeneity, it's not some, state that were people in. It's also history and change and evolution and flux and different groups coming into conflict.